This section is a little bit different. This is not necessarily information that you're going to need to do your literature review, but this is about the peer review process, which is a really important component of the structure of academia in general, but also specifically about research. And it's something that you should understand, even if you might not ever end up writing peer-reviewed papers. It's worth understanding what goes into it. So something you've probably heard me and Perry both say is that peer-reviewed papers are the most reliable. And of course, that's meant as a rough measure of reliability. But in general, that is like a quick decision point that people often use, is that in general, on average, peer-reviewed papers are going to be more reliable than other kinds of papers. And so I wanted to explain what peer review is and why we think that that is probably the case. And it's not necessarily something that you're going to need to navigate in your own careers, but it's worth understanding the process that goes into rigorous scholarly work. Yeah, it's just sort of background on how that work gets into a place where you can see it. Right? So here's a rough hierarchy of sources, and if you ask different people, maybe these will vary a little bit. But in general, if you were ranking sources from most reliable to least reliable, at least I would say, peer-reviewed journal articles are going to be at the top of that list. A book from a reputable university press, which is also very likely to be peer-reviewed. A dissertation from a reputable department in your field, and that's going to be expert reviewed. It's going to be advised by faculty and heavily edited and criticized by faculty in that department, which is different from peer review, but still, it's going to be subject to an extremely rigorous process. A paper in an edited volume. So these are, excuse me, generally books that have a few editors, and they solicit contributions from different researchers who each write like a chapter, and then it's published as a collection of papers. And these might be peer-reviewed or might not be. A conference proceedings paper, and this is when you present some work at a conference. Maybe you're giving a 20-minute talk, or maybe you're actually putting it on a giant poster and going to present it at the conference. Some of those conferences will later say, hey, if you write the paper up and send it in, we're going to publish a big book with the proceedings of all the stuff that was presented at the conference, and it'll be, lots and lots of different papers. And these are usually not peer-reviewed, although that can differ depending on the field. And then finally, there's an unpublished manuscript, which is just sort of something that, somebody writes and puts on a website, maybe their own website, maybe another website. And it's possible to use any of these. I don't want to discourage you from using any of them. This is generally the perceived rank of how reliable each of these sources are. And of course, there's going to be lots of overlap in quality between all of these categories. It's not like any peer-reviewed journal article is automatically excellent. Honestly, some of them are garbage. And it's not as if unpublished manuscripts are totally unreliable and can't be trusted. Some hugely influential papers in linguistics are unpublished manuscripts, and they're still super important papers and extremely high quality, and you'll get overlap between any of these categories. It's meant to be a rough guide on average to what you might expect the reliability of different sources to be. And of course, in the end, you hopefully gain some expertise. You're able to make your own assessments about the quality of a paper without having to rely on this too heavily, but it's a decent first pass guess that peer-reviewed journal articles are going to be pretty high quality, pretty reliable, and in general, this sort of rank system is going to encode how likely different sources are to be reliable. So, what is peer review, right? And I've subtitled this, or what is Jonah doing when he's not teaching? Because I spend a huge amount of my career engaged in this process in one way or another, both as an author and as a reviewer. This is like, hundreds of hours of my life spent in this process. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, this plays a really central role in all academic research. And just about all academics have some amount of respect for the peer review system and for the stuff that comes out of it. But almost uniformly, if you ask a researcher what they think about peer review, we hate it. It's so much work. It's so hard. It takes so much time. It can be deeply unpleasant. And here's just my sort of overview of how this works. So here's what we get from this report on what peer review is from 2010. Peer review is both a set of mechanisms and a principle at the heart of the system for evaluating and assuring the quality of research before and after it is funded or published. So this funded part, this is about grant applications. So this is where you write a big, long proposal to some agency with some money, and that's also going to be peer reviewed. Not as relevant to this class, so everything I say here is not about funding, it's about publishing. It involves subjecting research proposals and draft presentations, papers, and other publications to critical evaluation by independent experts, or peers. The reviewers are usually appointed by the funding body or the editors of a journal or other formal channel for communication to which the work has been submitted. So that's basically what peer review is. In the case of publishing, again, we're going to be focused on publishing here, not funding. You send a paper to somebody and they send it to a bunch of experts to review it, right? That's what peer review is. Here's their diagram of the process. Really, it's simple. Look, it's just this giant mess of different stages. It's okay if you can't read the individual boxes here. I'm just putting this here as a kind of joke to illustrate that this can be a very, very convoluted process, as this flow chart is meant to suggest. Here's the broad outline of what happens in peer review. You write a paper, right? That's sort of step 0. And then you're going to send that paper to a journal editor. And it might be given over from the main editor to a different sub-editor or associate editor who deals with particular subjects. Some journals do that, some don't. That editor, whoever winds up with it, is going to send the paper out to reviewers. Those reviewers will read the paper and they'll assess it and they'll write reviews of it and send those reviews back to the editor. And then the editor is going to write back to you and let you know what they've decided about your paper. Now, often the decision is going to be, oh, we got to do it over again. And so I've put a step 5 here, or steps 5 until the last step minus 1, right, is just repeating steps 1 through 4 as many times as needed until you reach a definitive verdict in the last step, which I'm calling step N here, where the paper is accepted or possibly rejected. So yeah, both of these things happen. Both of them have happened to me. Both of them have happened to most of your professors. So let's go into a little bit more detail here. This makes it look sort of simple and straightforward, but understand that each one of these steps has a whole lot of stuff that goes along with it. So we write the paper, and we often do this after presenting our research in different kinds of venues, and those could be professional workshops or colloquia. Colloquium is basically just a talk that somebody gives. It's usually invited. These could be conferences. We'll talk about conferences later in this class. Academic conferences are fun and informative. Maybe you've just presented it in class or something like that. If you're in a graduate seminar, maybe you've gone over this material with your grad students. And why do we present preliminary versions of our work in these different venues? Well, one reason is to make sure that we're not completely writing junk or that our ideas aren't really bad or crazy. You don't want to send out a terrible paper to a journal. It's going to be a waste of everybody's time and it's going to be embarrassing. So we like to get our work vetted in some way or another before we send it into a journal. And then the real review process begins once you send that paper in. The journal editor is entitled to do a desk review, and this happens more at some journals than at others, but this is where, before sending it out to anybody, the editor just looks at the paper, might skim it, might read it all the way through, and they figure out basic things like, is this garbage? Is it appropriate for the journal? Is it actually about the thing that our journal is about? Can it be read, right? Is it understandable? Do you have any idea what the guy's saying? And if it fails one of these tests, the editor will just reject it out of hand. That's called a desk reject. Not very common in linguistics, but it does happen a lot in other fields. These editors themselves, who are in charge of these journals, tend to be senior people in the field who have published a lot themselves. So generally they're going to be, professors, usually tenured professors, maybe full professors, who have been in the field for a long time, and they're given these editor positions as a kind of prestige within the discipline, and they're trusted to make decisions about what can actually go out for a review and about what can be published in the journal. Excuse me. Editors, in the general case, are not paid for this work. There are, again, a few exceptions to that amongst some really big, important scholarly journals, but for the most part, this is service work. It's work that you don't get paid for, that gets put on top of your normal teaching and research work, and you do it as a service to the profession, and also to some extent for the prestige, because there's some prestige associated with being an editor. But this is going to be a recurring theme throughout this process. Lots of unpaid labor in this process. So the editor, assuming that the paper is not completely incomprehensible, is going to send it out to some reviewers, and those reviewers can be generally professionals at any level above the doctorate, although occasionally in some fields you might review papers when you don't have your doctorate yet, when you're in a doctoral program. That does happen. Who are these reviewers? They might be professional contacts of the editor, so maybe they're like, oh, I know a woman who's an expert about that, I'm going to send it to her. They might be people who were cited in that submitted paper. Well, this paper keeps citing, Kingston 2008, I'm going to send it to Kingston, right? They might be recommended by the author, so some journals will ask the person submitting the paper if they have any good ideas about who would be good reviewers. They might just be generally recognized experts in the area, and hopefully they're going to be relatively removed from the specific issues under discussion. Like if you write a paper arguing that theory X is wrong, you don't want to then have your editor send that paper to the person who invented theory X. Like that's going to be problematic, and hopefully editors are not doing that. So at this stage of the peer review process, often you'll find huge delays because, again, reviewers are also not getting paid for this work. This is work that they do as a professional service on top of their normal jobs. And it's quite time consuming. I think it's fun personally, although a lot of people don't. And so again, it's very hard for the editors to actually find people willing to review these papers. And so they'll often be sending out requests to 10, 15, 20 reviewers, just trying to get 3 of them to read the paper and send reviews in. Right? So this can be extremely time consuming. The reviewers are going to, hopefully, eventually read the paper and write reviews and send those reviews back to the editor. Although there can be attrition here. There are people out there who will accept the review request and then just never write the review. That happens. And yeah, also, obviously, there can be huge delays at this point in the process because we're all very busy. We're teaching and we're doing our own research and whatever else. And now we have to read this paper and think about it critically and write a long review about it. In addition to that, this can take some people many months. And unfortunately, in linguistics in particular, there is a culture of people being late with things. And it is just sort of generally accepted in many areas of the field that everybody's going to be late with everything. Drives me nuts, but it is a problem within linguistics. So you might wait 5 or 6 months to hear back at this stage of the review process. That said, these reviews, at least in linguistics, are often very extensive, so like 4 to 10 pages long. They're going to be extremely carefully written and carefully reading the paper. They might comment on things like the fundamental soundness of your methodology, the relationship of your data to your conclusions, whether that's experimental data or just descriptive data about a language or something else, the overarching theoretical framework that you're working in, the mechanics of the paper. Is it clear? Is it well written? Is it organized properly? These are sort of the main topics that you get comments on. And then the reviewer will make a recommendation, and the exact number and nature of these categories might be a little bit different in different journals, but basically there's 3 kinds of recommendations. Accept, which is extraordinarily rare on the first round of peer review. I've never had a paper accepted in the first round, and I'm not sure I know anybody else who has either. Most common one is revise and resubmit. So we invite you to send the paper back once you've fixed all of these things. And then the last one here is reject. And this is just like, we don't even want you to rewrite this. There's no way it's going to get published the way it is. So just, we pass. Thank you very much, right? Linguistics journals don't tend to have super high rejection rates, at least not on the first round, although some of the bigger ones do have fairly high rejection rates. In some other much bigger fields, when you're talking about like the premier journal in the field of experimental psychology or something, which is 50 times as big as linguistics, they're rejecting 90% of all the papers that get submitted to them. So that's how that often ends up. And yeah, so that's what you get in a review. You get a really detailed commentary on the paper along with a recommendation about what should happen to it next. The editor then takes all these reviews that he or she has gotten from all of the reviewers who have responded, and they have to make a decision about what's going to happen to the paper next. And that's going to be based mostly on the reviews and on the recommendations of the reviewers, but it can also involve the editor's judgment. And this often happens, especially if you have an even number of reviewers, and like 2 of them think that it should be revised, but 2 of them think it should be rejected. The editor's going to have to make a decision there. They might consult with other editors at the journal, if there are other editors there. And hopefully, when the editor gets back to you about the decision, it's going to contain explicit information about the road forward, about what exactly do we need to see in order to have this accepted in the next round. Now, editors can fail on any number of these criteria. And I mean, again, editors are not being paid. They're doing this sort of out of the goodness of their hearts. Nobody likes making difficult judgments. And in particular, giving people guidance about what would need to happen in the next round is sort of a difficult job, and it's hard to exactly figure out, and it involves kind of making people implicit promises, and a lot of editors are just hesitant to do this, which is really deeply unfortunate. The worst thing is when you get a verdict from an editor and it just sort of summarizes what the reviewers said and tells you to resubmit the paper, but doesn't really tell you what to emphasize or what they would want to see in the next round in order to accept the paper. This is really frustrating, but it does also happen. And then the steps 5 to second to last is to repeat this entire review process, assuming that you got a revise and resubmit. And this it's very common to go through 2 to 4 rounds of revision before being published. My most recent 2 papers, I think one of them got accepted on the 3rd round. I am currently on one that has been conditionally accepted, but only with a 4th round of revisions. And this process can take years. It is extremely time consuming when you're going through 3 rounds of peer review and rewriting and responding to the reviews and sending them back into the journal. It is just incredibly long process. Some journals are better than others, but also as a rule, at least in linguistics, some of the biggest and most prestigious journals are also the slowest, and it is impossible dealing with this review process. So appreciate that when you see a good paper in a peer-reviewed linguistics journal, it may have taken an extraordinary amount of work to get there. So final step here, paper is accepted, yay! So open a bottle of champagne, and then remember that you still have to deal with typesetting and copy editing processes from the publisher. They send you proofs to make sure that it's printed accurately, and you have to check those and send back revisions. And then they want your graphics files with your tables and plots to be of a particular format with this many dots per square inch, and the system keeps rejecting them, and you have to regenerate the graphics files. Then you have to sign this copyright agreement, blah, 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 blah. So there's actually still a fair amount of work after the paper gets accepted just in getting the manuscript ready. But this is where you win and the paper is going to be published, right? So excellent. This is how papers, peer-reviewed papers, get to be the way they are. And it's important to understand this because, you know, this really shapes what kind of research is going to be in the output of this process. It's been thoroughly vetted and checked and criticized and revised. This is a very lengthy, very involved process, at least at reputable peer-reviewed journals. Now, there's another issue here, which is that in recent years, as institutions have started formalizing the requirements for everybody to publish in peer-reviewed journals, right? So there's like guidelines about how many papers you have to publish in a peer-reviewed journal to be a professor now. Lots and lots of journals have arisen to basically pretend that they're peer-reviewed and publish bad papers when the authors pay them money. So there's also lots of not reputable fake peer-reviewed journals out there now as well. But assuming this is a real peer-reviewed journal, you can be pretty sure that it's gone through a lengthy and rigorous process before being published. Right? And that's why we put some faith in this system. That said, peer review has a number of problems, and this goes back to, if you ask academics about going through peer review, they pretty much universally hate it, right? So here's a summary from that same report. As peer review has become a more fundamental part of the research landscape, it has been subject itself to scrutiny and review. In the UK, several reports were commissioned in the light of government concerns about the efficiency and effectiveness of the peer review process. In 1990, the Bowden Report for the blah 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 council concluded that there were no practicable alternatives to peer review, even though the process was significantly fallible. 5 years later, a Royal Society report reached similar conclusions, but stressed the burden imposed on peer reviewers, particularly when success rates are low. So, this is written in sort of very dry prose, but to translate what they're basically saying here, they're saying that peer review is the worst system for scientific publishing, with the exception of all the other systems that have ever been tried. This is a slight variation on a possibly apocryphal quote from Winston Churchill about democracy, but this is really what they're saying, that we don't have any other options, but there's a number of giant problems with this process. So I'm going to go into those problems shortly in the next slide, but basically we think that peer review is the best available way to get a very preliminary assurance of the quality of a paper, but it's also worth understanding the weaknesses of the peer review process, because this may affect the way that we choose to interpret the literature. And the main thing I want to warn you off here is the idea that just because something's published in a peer-reviewed journal, it must be true, or it must be a good paper, or the authors must know what they're doing. That's not necessarily true. It's only a very, very rough guide to the expected quality of a paper. There are many weaknesses in this process. So here are some of them mentioned by that report that we were just looking at. This one I've already emphasized, it's slow. This is harmful to the careers of academics, of researchers, because you're trying to get hired for a job where you have to have publications and it's taking you a year, 2 years to get these things into print. That's not good, right? It's also slowing down the dissemination of knowledge, right? If nothing is actually getting published until a year or 2 years after the research is done, then basically progress is not going to be made during those years or 2 years. We're going to be behind in actually disseminating the results of research. This is kind of a big one. It's fallible in detecting misconduct and malpractice. And this is more true, again, in experimental work. It's possible, though probably pretty uncommon, for scientists to basically fake experiments and fake data and lie about what they did. That doesn't seem to be particularly common, but it's certainly a possibility. More common is a version of malpractice in which some researchers are just really bad at analyzing data, and it's not always that easy to see what they've done when you're a peer reviewer. And so I would actually take this statement that they make, that it's fallible in detecting misconduct and malpractice, and I would say that it is mostly useless in detecting misconduct and malpractice. If you have a lying criminal who's sending in fake research to a journal, there's no way that peer reviewers are going to catch that in the course of a normal peer review process, unless they write something totally crazy in a manuscript. Peer review is not meant to detect people who are lying. It operates on the assumption of good faith, that people sending in papers are being honest, right? I don't know that there's an obvious way to fix this problem, but certainly peer review is never going to be able to fix this. Right? And that means not just for dishonesty, but also just for bad practice with data analysis, with interpretation, that can get past reviewers pretty easily. So just because something was peer reviewed doesn't mean that all the claims are right or that everything was done perfectly. Right? It means that it passed some minimal standards of being able to satisfy an expert in a preliminary way. So that's a big one. This third point, subjective and inconsistent. This is extremely frustrating from the end of the author, for sure, that you send papers in and you get totally different opinions from totally different reviewers. you might get one reviewer who's super hostile and just has like nasty things to say about your paper. And then maybe the other reviewer is like, oh, this was great. I thought it was really well written and interesting. And or even opposite directions. Like, I think you ought to do this thing this way. And then reviewer two says, I think you ought to do this thing the complete opposite way. And then how do you deal with that? Right? And more generally, it can just be an extremely frustrating process because there's an element of random chance about who does this paper or this grant proposal get sent to. And really, the way that they evaluate the paper is going to depend almost entirely on their research background. So this is sort of a lottery in some ways. Not that it's completely random, but just that there's a high level of subjectivity and inconsistency and random chance in this process, which is extremely frustrating when you're putting in hundreds of hours of work into trying to get a paper published. The fourth point here is overly conservative, and what they mean by that is that this kind of process, because it's like a panel of multiple reviewers, the papers that are most likely to succeed most easily in getting through this process are the ones that sort of don't do anything different or spectacular and just look more or less like standard papers that you expect to see in this field. That aren't going to offend anybody or aren't going to raise many questions for many reviewers. Whereas any paper that does anything novel or reaches unusual conclusions or makes a strong claim or a strong statement is more likely to catch the attention of, and negative attention from, in particular, one or more reviewers, right? If you sort of have to please everybody, the best way to do that is by not doing anything alarming or something like that. And in the end result, when you average this over hundreds and thousands of peer review processes, it means that the literature that comes out of this is going to be overly conservative. It's going to not make many innovations, not feature many strong or interesting claims. It's just going to be sort of middle of the road stuff that comes out of this process that's mostly typical of what happens in the field. And that's really not what you necessarily want being published in your academic journal. Finally, this last one is unsustainable in practical and economic terms. And what they mean by that is, again, getting back to the time involved in this, that process that I've just described in so much detail, that involves dozens, if not hundreds of hours of highly trained experts in some field just to produce a single paper, right? And it's just an extremely time-consuming and in-depth way to evaluate papers. And nobody in this process, with the exception of a few journal editors maybe, are actually being paid for this labor. This is something that everybody in research is expected to do as a professional service to the field. But we have all sorts of other demands on our time. And it's very, very hard to get people to do these reviews for no money when they have other jobs to attend to. Another underlying issue here that's sort of gestured at in this statement is that many times the entities that own these journals are not themselves academic institutions or professional societies. A lot of these journals are owned by private for-profit corporations, and they make huge amounts of money by selling access to the journals to libraries, to university libraries for the most part. They make tens of millions of dollars in profit every year, while the people doing the actual work here are not even getting paid for it. The authors aren't paid, the reviewers aren't paid, and the editors aren't paid for the most part. So what they're pointing out here is that, this has sort of worked for 100 years or so, but as we get more and more and more researchers trying to publish more and more and more papers in more and more and more journals, this is like a pyramid scheme. Eventually, we're just going to run out of hours that people can spend on this unremunerated labor. And there's no way that this can scale up to last for the next 100 years. This is unsustainable, is the claim here. So these are all major problems with peer review. And it's worth knowing about some of these if you're thinking of going into a professional academic setting. You are going to have to navigate and deal with this peer review process at some point. And it can be extremely tough. That said, it can also be extremely rewarding at times. But there are real non-trivial problems with the peer review process. As the report suggests, though, we have not yet found a better way to do this, right? So we don't really have any better alternatives, but it's still worth noting some of the problems that arise from this peer review process. And that's what I have to say about peer review.